I suspect many of you are, at least to some extent, aware of the difference in the Thanksgiving holiday here in Canada with the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. When I look back at my youth, I don't remember a lot about celebrating Thanksgiving. I think my first real memory of Thanksgiving is actually when I went away to university and lived a long way from home, and then at Thanksgiving, everyone went home for the first time, and I remember taking note of Thanksgiving then. That's not to say that my mom never made a turkey or anything like that. I mean, we had it, but it didn't weigh too heavily on me. Then I had the experience of living in the United States for 3 years and discovered that there Thanksgiving is absolutely a much more massive part of life. Society comes to a complete stop for the 4 days of the Thanksgiving weekend. People will travel great distances to visit their family. In fact, it's the norm. It's expected. And if you are living alone or wherever you are, somebody will invite you over for Thanksgiving dinner, and you will be a part of a big gathering, no matter what and where you are. Thanksgiving is an absolutely essential part of American life. I find that when we read the stories of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels, wherever he traveled around, he taught and he interacted with people and he healed the sick, we find little scenes of God's kingdom emerging from nowhere. These wonderful scenes of life and of joy and of intimacy with God bursting forth unexpectedly like a kind of spring bursting in the desert. This is what we find in our gospel story from Luke this morning. Jesus passing routinely enough through the regions of Galilee and Samaria on his way to Jerusalem, and there in an unexpected interaction, there bursts forth the kingdom of God. What does the kingdom of God look like when it begins to surround Jesus? The kingdom of God is seen in acts of mercy. As Jesus was passing by a particular town, there began to be a racket at some distance away from him. And it was a group of 10 men who were calling out his name, "Master, have mercy on us." Why were these men shouting at Jesus from a distance, calling him Master and begging his mercy? Well, these were men who suffered from leprosy. Leprosy, as many of you know, is a bacterial infection. It causes damage to different systems of our body, the skin and the eyes and the nerves. And I think in particular it's the nerve damage which is most dangerous because folks who are suffering from leprosy often can hurt themselves or suffer some kind of wound or infection and not realize it because of the damaged nerves, and therefore the damage becomes that much worse over time. Thank goodness in our day and age there is a cure for leprosy, and in the last 20 or 30 years, the number of cases of leprosy worldwide has absolutely plummeted. But certainly in the time of Jesus, some 2,000 years ago, there certainly was no cure for leprosy. And leprosy is passed on through human contact. And while leper colonies are relatively rare in the world today, in the time of Jesus, to be afflicted with leprosy was to be cast out, and to live among other lepers on the margins of society, but to be banished, to be quarantined, to be refused all kinds of routine contact with other folks, even if they were your family. And so they always had to stand off at some distance. And so here are these 10 men suffering from leprosy, and they know they're not to come near Jesus, nor to come near anyone else. And so they're forced to call to him, to shout, to raise their voices, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And Luke, the gospel writer, tells us that Jesus responded, and we can well imagine that he too was forced to raise his voice. He shouted back at them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And those men did as they told, and they went on their way, and as they journeyed, they found themselves having been healed. This incurable condition had been removed from them. And so what we find is that the kingdom of God begins with acts of mercy. God has intervened. God has acted unexpectedly to show grace and mercy to those who had called out to Jesus from their desperation. And the kingdom of God is begun with acts of mercy. Perhaps you know, as I do, folks with a remarkable and a wonderful faith in God. We know those who pray earnestly and expect God to answer. And many of those folks who have such a wonderful, faithful, and hopeful prayer life are those who are able to see God at work in the midst of good and also in the midst of bad. Those who, no matter what is going on around them, are able to see the grace and the mercy of God, to see God at work in their lives. And isn't this what faith is, friends? And it is through faith that we are able to see God at work. God is an objective reality. What God does is real, but God allows in our own experience for us to make that subjective, and God gives us the eyes of faith with which to see. And through such eyes, we're able to see the wonderful mercy of God at work all around. So we find in the stories of Jesus that the kingdom of God begins to break forth in acts of God's mercy. And we see also that the kingdom of God consists of thanksgiving. Those 10 who were on their way to show themselves to the priests, as Jesus had instructed them to, found themselves having been healed. One of the 10, upon discovering this return to health, turned immediately around and, as the gospel writer tells us, with a loud voice began giving glory and praise to God. And then when he came back and found Jesus, he fell on his face at the feet of the Master and gave him thanks. And we find that wherever the kingdom of God is breaking forth, people having received acts of God's mercy are giving God their thanks and their praise. In the last community where I served as a minister, there was a retirement community known as the Villages. And like many retirement communities, it had houses specially designed for seniors in a designed in a planned community, and at the center of the development was a community center. And every Thanksgiving, some of the residents of the Villages put on a Thanksgiving meal for their friends and their neighbors, and it was a very popular event. Well, one year there was one resident of the Villages who caused quite a stir among his neighbors by writing an article in the newsletter in which he expressed that he did not appreciate the holiday of Thanksgiving and all its religious overtones. He was not a believer in God, and sort of resented this idea of being forced to give thanks to God and of attending a meal at which grace would be said. He conceded that it was a good idea to give thanks where one could, and though he would not participate in the grace before the meal, he would try and make a point of going around to say thank you to those who had prepared the meal. This caused quite a stir, and I think the reason was that this gentleman in particular seems to have missed the fact that virtually all of those folks who were going to be doing the preparation of their meal were Christians, and in fact were going to prepare the meal for their friends and neighbors because of their faith. They were motivated and empowered and enlivened by their faith. And it was not in order to receive simply the gratitude from others that they would prepare this meal, but because they themselves were thankful for all that God had done. And out of God's abundance, they were inspired to share. And this thankfulness was the reason for a meal at which people could gather. And so we see thankfulness wherever the kingdom of God has burst forth. We see also that the outsider becomes included. You see, this 1 out of 10 who had been healed, who returned to Jesus, giving praise to God on his way and falling at the feet of Jesus to give thanks when he arrived, was a Samaritan. Some of you may know a little bit about the conflict between Jews and Samaritans in the time of Jesus. We may look back on that now as either unfortunate or silly. They were ethnically related, cousins, if you will. Their religious beliefs were similar, if divergent on a few points that may seem minor to us. And yet the cultural conflict between Jews and Samaritans in the time of Jesus was almost as fierce as any cultural conflict we can imagine in the world today. And it was particularly fierce from the perspective of the Jews, of which Jesus and his followers were among. Not that the Jews wished to do violence to the Samaritans, but that they saw the Samaritans as a vile corruption of God's covenant people. You see, they were God's chosen instruments in the world. And that the law of God was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that the worship of God was to take place in Jerusalem on Mount Zion was the very essence of their identity. And even the smallest corruption was not to be accepted. It was an absolute threat to their very way of being. And so the Jews looked down their nose at the Samaritans, as the Samaritans looked down their nose at the Jews. And yet Jesus here, and by extension the early Christians, and by extension the gospel writers here and elsewhere, celebrate the inclusion of this outsider within the celebration of the inbreaking of God's kingdom. It occurs to me that much of human society is based on the attempt to exclude an outsider. If you're an outsider, you want to become an insider. You want people like you to be fellow insiders so that you can have advantage at the expense of some other form of outsiders. We as humans have a hard time including people who are not like we are. And much of the story of human history is the story of people doing nasty things to those who are not like them. And yet here Jesus is turning this prevalent feature of human society on its head, celebrating the inclusion of this outsider. Jesus has elsewhere said, as many of you know, that the way to the kingdom, the way to life is in fact the narrow way on which few will travel. We are meant to hear in this place not so much the fearfulness of how few will travel it, but the good news that anyone may. We find also in this story that where the kingdom of God bursts forth, there is new life. And not just a renewal of the old life, but a whole new kind of kingdom life. Jesus said to this Samaritan who was on the ground in front of him giving thanks, "Get up. Your faith has saved you." And we're to take note, I think, of the fact that it was not the healing from leprosy which was his salvation. Certainly that was the grace of God at work in his life. Rather, the salvation was the reorientation of that one's life towards God and in thankfulness and praise to God for all of the mercy which had been received. Where once this Samaritan had been at least half turned away towards God, he has now turned fully towards God and even set his posture in the most humble of positions in order to give God thanks and praise. And it is through this orientation of his self and the restoration of the relationship with God which it enables is his salvation. One commentator on this passage has noted something which he says, would have been unmistakable to the earliest Christians who were Greek speakers and to whom Luke, the gospel writer, wrote in their Greek tongue. That the word Jesus used for get up or rise is the same word as resurrection. And so, in a manner of speaking, Jesus was inviting this Samaritan who had been saved by his thankfulness and his praise and his act of faith, which turned him toward God, has been invited from that moment forward to live this new resurrection life. As I said a few minutes ago, the Thanksgiving holiday is one of the most defining aspects of American life. If you watch any American TV programs, you'll note that every season they have a Thanksgiving episode, for example. Now we have in our house some children's picture books about Clifford, the big red dog. Some of you may have read Clifford the Big Red Dog at some other point in your life. And of course, there is a Thanksgiving book in the Clifford the Big Red Dog series. Now, Clifford is looked after by a little girl named Emily Elizabeth and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Howard. And in this Thanksgiving volume, the family, along with Clifford in tow, is headed to the train station in order to take a short trip to visit some extended family in order to have a Thanksgiving meal. And what they are taking, besides themselves, is a dish of Mrs. Howard's famous stuffing. Well, they get to the train station, and there's a real snowstorm developing. And just before they're about to get on the train for the short trip to go and visit their family, they learn that the tracks have been closed, the trains have been canceled because of the snowstorm. Well, they're about to leave and go back home, and they realize that the conditions have gotten so bad that the roads have been closed, and they're not going to be able to leave probably until the next morning. And so they're stuck on Thanksgiving Day with this dish of stuffing. Well, it just so turns out that there were some other folks in the same situation. There was a gentleman who was going to visit his family, and he was going to take his famous cornbread. There was another little girl from Emily Elizabeth's class who, with her family, was going to go and have Thanksgiving, and they were of Hispanic background, and they had brought a dish of Thanksgiving tamales. And lo and behold, the man at the ticket booth had been cooking a turkey in the oven in the staff room. And these folks who were stuck together in the train station in this Thanksgiving Day in the midst of a snowy night sat down at one of the modest little tables in the waiting area and had a Thanksgiving dinner. Well, friends, the good news of our faith and our hope is not that there would be a sudden outbreak of U.S. Thanksgiving, but that there would be sudden outbreaks of the kingdom of God in our midst. And one of the ways through which the kingdom of God might burst forth is through our acts of giving thanks for all of the mercies God has shown. We gather here to give God our thanks and our praise with the hopes that in some way the kingdom of God might break forth. Next Saturday, we invite members of our community, particularly those who are in greatest need, to come and get some winter clothes if they need them, and to enjoy a hot meal in the hopes that the kingdom of God might break forth. This is our mission as the Church of Jesus Christ. This is why God has put us here. So let us, in a few minutes' time, rise and go forward with new resurrection life. That through us and around us, and for others to see, the kingdom of God might begin to break out and to burst forth. Praise be to God.